make it here to Sunday school, whether in person or via the little camera thing, live stream thing. We're here today to begin a new section, a new Sunday school series, not a section, new series on church history. I was looking at it, and last year, a few weeks, about 5 weeks earlier than this year, we did a series on the ancient church, started that, and so I figured we go to part 2 of church history. I don't want to, give you all the fun things, but a few things. We come today to the opening up of the medieval church, right? And I guess I should begin with a little story. Yeah, people like stories, right? So in the year 1002, about 1,000 years ago, on the island of Britain, there was a group of Anglo-Saxons, guys with beards, braids, long hair, axes, that sort of thing. And they were living in a village. There's gals there too and kids, and they had a group of Vikings come. And the Vikings didn't come to raid like usual. They came to sit and stay and kind of hang out. And you'd think Vikings are kind of bloodthirsty, really intense, killing machines, and not these guys. These were Danes, and they stayed. And there's a report that says after about a couple of months, the Anglo-Saxons one day killed all the Vikings. They killed all the Danes. They massacred them at nighttime. And that's not really interesting. That happened a lot. The interesting thing is why. I found this interesting. It's an interesting story. Why the Anglo-Saxons killed the Vikings in this little town. The Chronicle tells us that they killed them because they were threatening the chastity of the Anglo-Saxon women. In other words, you read between the lines, they were going to take our gals away. Now, why were they going to do that? Were they kind of sneaking around and being really nefarious? No. Here's what was so tempting to the Anglo-Saxon ladies. These Vikings combed their hair and beard every single day. That was too much. And second, they bathed once a week. They bathed every Saturday. That's insane. Why would you bathe once? That's too much. Why would you bathe once a week? That's the medieval war. That's the Middle Ages, right? That's what you think of, isn't it? Women get too attracted to people who bathe once a week. It's crazy talk around here. Now, boys and girls, that's no excuse for you not to bathe as often as your parents say you need to bathe. But it was a different time, right? Different time, weird place, weird world. And I suppose it's interesting because when we think about the Middle Ages, when I think about the Middle Ages, I don't have a great opinion of them. That's kind of what I think of. People killing people because they bathe too much. People killing folks because they comb their hair every day, right? Barbarians. Weird dark ages. And the sad thing is, that's not just true for the normal American who thinks medieval people are all about crusades and insane, zealotry. But that's true for Christians as well. That's true particularly for Protestant Christians, which is what we are. Surprise, it's what we are here. It's true of Christians who want to understand their history. For most of us, I will just tell you this. At every seminary I went to, I had to go to a second one, the first one didn't take. At every seminary I went to, when we had church history classes, there was never a history class just on the Middle Ages. And by the way, just so we're clear, when I say Middle Ages, we're talking about roughly a 1,000-year period, 500 to 1500 AD. Those are zeros, not sixes. 500 to 1,000 years. And in any class I took, it was always medieval and Reformation church history. It was always the Middle Ages, and then we need to get to the good stuff, Luther and Calvin and Zwingli and all those guys. It was always the Middle Ages were bad, and then Luther comes in, rides in, and nails the theses to the door. October 31st, 1517, hallelujah. The angels break out in chorus. All of Western history is saved, right? That's kind of how it's portrayed, I think, for most of us too. I mean, if I had to kind of, sum up the average view of church history, it's a little bit like this. For most American evangelicals or Protestants, Christ dies 33 AD. We love the book of Acts, right? There's a lot that goes on, the first century. the year 100 AD. We can enjoy some of Augustine, you know. We like his stuff. So around the year, 300/400. And then huge chunk of history, 15, 17. And then we get into all of our stuff, right? For most of us, church history has a huge parenthesis right here. For most of us, if I were to ask you, how many medieval Christians could you name? I think a lot of us maybe could name a guy named Thomas Aquinas, perhaps. Who else? I'm not asking you. You can think about yourself, right? How many medieval Christians could we name? I think that's because we've actually taken in far more of the modern secular view of history than we care to admit. We've taken in a lot more of a non-Christian view on the Middle Ages than we care to admit. We think of them classically, sadly, as the Dark Ages. We call them the Dark Ages because, you have the glory of Rome, you have the glory of Christianity all across the empire, and then, bam, it collapses. 1,000 years, there's not much culture. People are astonished if you bathe once a week. They will kill you, in fact, if you do that, right? Don't bathe too much. That's what we think of, popularly. But here's the question. Who actually coined the term? Who was the first person to coin the term Dark Age? Dark Ages. Anybody know? This is a random trivia question. I don't usually do this, but any idea? No Googling? No Wikipedia? Who coined the term the Dark Ages? Any idea? I know we have some history students here. The guy who did it was actually about 100 years before Luther, roughly the 1400s. He's an Italian guy by the name of Petrarch. He was a famous Italian Renaissance thinker. And he said, the Dark Ages, were so dark because we lost Rome, we lost Greece, we lost the classical tradition. But now we've come into the light, the golden ages. Now we've come into the age that really matters. My age. Right? Isn't that what we all think? We all think our age is the best age. We live in a golden age. We want to be in the bright ages. And so the Dark Ages is actually not a Christian term. The idea that the Dark Ages are this time of evil or stupidity or dullness or no intellectual ferment, that's not true. Perhaps the most classical building of the Middle Ages is the Cathedral of Notre Dame. If you've seen the Disney movie, Hunchback of Notre Dame, one of the best, by the way, in my personal opinion, but it's always a little bit dark for kids. I like it. It has a more realistic view of sin. Paul would have liked it too, I think. Augustine as well. But it takes place in Paris. It takes place in the Middle Ages. It takes place at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And Notre Dame is what they call, the art history nerds call it, a Gothic cathedral. Because that's what Petrarch and his bros, his buddies, called it. They called the best medieval, the most beautiful cathedrals, they called them Gothic style. Why do you think they did that? Requires a little bit of European history knowledge here. If you call something Gothic, is that a good thing? The answer is no. Because it refers to the barbarian tribe, Philip. Exactly. Yeah, the Goths, right? Visigoths, Ostrogoths, whatever Goths you like. They weren't good people, right? It's actually an insult. The most beautiful piece of Christian, ecclesiastical, church architecture. When part of it burned down a couple of years ago, all of France pitched in to try to restore it. It's that important to French identity even today in a secular country. Beautiful, and yet To this day, we call it Gothic, and we don't even think it's a bad thing. But the folks who invented it, the folks who first called it, said it's barbaric. It's a barbarian form of architecture because they believed they were in the perfect time where they could emerge from the church. They could emerge out of Christianity. They could go back to Rome and Greece and get the kind of pagan influence, get the classical influence. And so their belief was dark. Dark. And you think that too, right? You and I think the most annoying, medieval, big, boring question is, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? You've heard that, right? How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? We think that's the definition of boring church. That's the definition of a boring Christian, somebody who just debates in their ivory tower how many angels can dance on the head of the pin. Now, let me tell you, that's actually not a bad question. You might think that that's a stupid question. It's actually a really good question. I cannot find, if you can look it up and find that out, you can, stump your pastor. I cannot find that actual question in a medieval theologian. Maybe you can look it up in your medieval catalog. But it's a really good question. You might not think it is. It's a really good question because it's trying to figure out, how does heaven intersect with earth? How does God's space and our space connect? The Middle Ages talked a lot about stuff like that because they wanted to figure out, how does my life connect with God's life? How does what I do, threading and using a pin and a needle and all that sort of stuff, knitting and crocheting that I can't do, some of y'all can do it. How does that connect with God? How does that connect with the angels? It's what you say when you want to say, worship is all of life. They were trying to ask that question. Or think about our worship in an hour, less than an hour now. When folks say, I really felt the Spirit. When folks say, I met with God. I felt Jesus there. It's in the same ballpark as how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. The answer, by the way, in case you're wondering, there's an answer to it. 0. 0 angels. Because angels do not occupy physical space. They're spiritual beings. Just FYI, in case you're wondering. You can tell that to all your friends at the parties you go to. But they're trying to answer the question, how can God be omnipresent? How can he fill all in all and yet take on one physical body in the incarnation of the Son of God? How can he do all that spiritually and yet take on this one body? It's a really important question. And so please, here's my spiel. Don't ever think the Middle Ages are dark ages. That's the lie of the popular American culture. It's the lie of Protestant propaganda. If you flip to the back of Calvin's Institutes, sometimes, one of the things, by the way, I shouldn't give side notes. Side note. Whenever you go to the back, whenever you're reading a book, it's always good to see, who are they quoting? Who are their sources? Who are they not quoting? That tells you a little bit about their influences, right? For good or for bad. So if you go to the back of Calvin's Institutes, you go to the back of Luther's writings, you will find Augustine. You'll find the Bible, of course, a lot. But you will find these guys quoting from Bernard of Clairvaux all the time. Medieval guy. Bonaventure, medieval guy. Peter Lombard, medieval guy. Aquinas, of course, medieval guy. Luther and Calvin and the Reformers never said, the medieval church is so bad, it's an awful church, we're making a new church. If you doubt me, read Calvin's introductory letter to the Institutes, where he writes to the bigwig King Francis II of France, and he says just what I'm saying right here. He says, look, we're not making a new church. There were some radicals who thought that, but by and large, if you get nothing else from this entire course, I'll give you the main thing right up front, right here, right now. The Reformation, the movement of Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, was the best of the Middle Ages trying to correct the worst of the Middle Ages. The Reformation was the best elements of the Dark Ages, so-called, trying to combat and reform and correct the worst elements. It's very similar if you think about the Old Testament Israel. It's like Josiah finding the book of the law in the temple. In fact, this is what Calvin would use it from time to time as an illustration. Josiah finds the book of the law. And what does he do? He calls God's people to scriptural renewal. That's why we should never say the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages are dark. Second thing, of course, we think they're not the Reformers. We think the Middle Ages was the opposite of the Reformation. I've already mentioned no. They didn't think that. There was some difference, of course. But if you want to know who you are as a Christian today, if you want to know who you are as an American Protestant Christian, if you want to know who you are as a Presbyterian, you need to know the Middle Ages. You need to know the background. You need to know, why did Luther say what he said? Why did Calvin say what he said? Why do I say what I say? A lot of what we do today is, in part, connected to the Middle Ages and the reform that was happening for a long time prior to Luther. I have a wife. I'm a pastor. That wouldn't have happened 1,500 years ago. How did that change? At least in the West. Why did that change? You can't just look at Luther. I can go back, right? A third thing, we believe there's corruption in the Middle Ages. You know, the popes had mistresses, the priests were out for money. There was corruption all over, and that's what Luther pointed out, right? You think of Tetzel, going in the copper ring, sold from Purgatory Springs, right? Using grace to get cash. You know, I talk to folks around here. I go door to door occasionally when we did that at the church, and y'all were with me. Y'all remember. One of the most common questions I get is, "Oh, are y'all here to ask for money?" And I always say, "No. We're here to sing carols, and we're here to pray for you. We're not here for money," but people think that today. So if you think the Middle Ages was corrupt, today it's corrupt too. You can think of Ted Haggard, you know. You can think of the televangelist. There's corruption today. You see, the point is simply that the Middle Ages are not just this dead period. That's my point so far. They're not a dead period. They're not a dark period. There's a great deal of life in the Middle Ages. Sure, there's diseases in it. Sure, there's corruption in it. But corruption attacks life. Diseases attack your body. But the Reformation itself did not come from the heretical movement. It's very important to note, the Reformers did not spring up with the Cathars, the Waldensians, the Albigensians, the Hussites, the Lollards. They did not come primarily from the heretical movements of the medieval church. They came from Mother Rome herself. They came from the Roman Catholic Church. Because they wanted to reform her. That's why John Owen, you know John Owen, we have his books out there. In the 1600s, he would say, "I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic. A Reformed Catholic, but a Catholic." And I know we're in the middle of Southern Baptist territory. I know we're in the middle of the South here. I know even saying that, you're like, "Oh, I'm leaving." To even think that is so strange. That's why one of the top questions I get from folks is, why do we confess we believe in the Catholic Church, right? This is why we do it. This is why we do it, because we believe that we are not separated from the history of the church in all ages. We believe that we're part of this great story. This is your story as well. That's why I have this quote in the back here from Mark Frank. He was an old Church of England theologian, 1600s. He says this: "It is ridiculous to think that the custom and practice and interpretations of all churches should be false, except for yesterday's, mine. Unless we can think the Spirit of truth has been asleep for 1,500 years and just woke up. Or Christ should found the church and promise to be with it to the end of the world and then leave it to Antichrist to be guided for 1,500 years." In other words, friends, he's saying so much of what I was taught growing up as a Baptist. I was a Baptist, right? Southern Baptist. You know, I was in CBF, SBC churches from time to time, and I was taught in my Baptist history classes. They weren't super in depth, but what they said was, look, for 1,500 years, basically, corruption, darkness, corruption, Luther, and then John Smith, right, the first Baptist. First great Baptist. Okay, cool. How arrogant is that, friends? How presumptuous is that? To say that there has not been life in the church that Christ himself promises the gates of hell will not prevail. Did they prevail for 1,500 years? I don't think so. I don't think they prevailed for 1,500 years. It is to doubt Christ's promise, to believe that in the Middle Ages we have some kind of dead church that only gets revived, way down the road. So I'll stop there and take a little water here. Any questions, any thoughts, cares, concerns, pushback, clarifications? Greg, I heard a little noise over there.
Spiritual God stuff, and the remains with this idea that, like you said, that we've now discovered, that this is the right way of doing it. That a lot of what we have today in church is that we don't let this church is the one that's rediscovered. Everybody else has been wrong all these years. Suddenly, this pastor or small group of folks say it's what it is, and it's just sad.
Well, it's why tonight when we come to the Lord's table, one of the things I'll say is, hey, this is not a Presbyterian table. It's not a Baptist table. It's a Christian table. It's the Lord's table. It's a Catholic table in that sense, right? A table for all who bend the knee to Jesus, all who need and know they need him, all who call upon his name. Yeah, great point, Greg. Yeah, Ted. That's next week. But I'll make one quick point if I can. The question was, what role do translations? Huge role. That's one of the things I'll talk about a lot next week. But very briefly, it's important to know that there are two divides in Europe. There are two divides in Europe. We know one big divide, the East-West divide. There's one big divide, the East-West divide. The Latin in the West, East, Greek. Like we're going to talk about the Byzantine Church. By the way, I'm going to do that because obviously I love the Byzantine Church, and nobody ever talks about them in classes like this. So I'm going to. We'll do a week or two on that. So there's the East-West divide, East Greek, Latin, West. There's also, however, the North-South divide. I probably shouldn't say this, but I think I will go ahead and say it. Even though I don't like either of these alcoholic beverages, but if you just do a study of where the best beer is, you will find typically it's in northern climates in Europe, Belgium, Germany, that sort of thing. You will find that wine tends to be in the southern parts, the more Mediterranean countries, Italy, France, Spain. That's just one example. You can think of plenty others that don't have anything to do with alcohol. Just one example of the other huge divide that we don't think about in the Middle Ages, but it's really present even today. It's the North-South divide. Not in the U.S., not talking about here, but there's a North-South divide as well that plays a lot into the translation game. There's a reason why Luther in Germany is the perfect guy at the perfect moment as a German to translate the New Testament into modern German. There's a reason why it didn't occur in Italy until later. There's a reason why Erasmus in the Spanish Netherlands, the Low Countries, not in the South, but in the North, was the first guy one of the first guys to really focus on translations. That's down the road. But yeah, so short answer, yes. I suppose I missed this, so I guess I'll tell you now. Just FYI, how I run these courses, how these work out. We're going to spend about 12 weeks. I should have done this at the beginning, but hey, people are here now, so that's probably good. 12 weeks roughly. And the way I do it, and y'all may hate it, I don't know, nobody's told me otherwise. You tell you like it, so I'll keep doing it until you tell me not to. 12 weeks, and it's kind of a potpourri. In other words, we're going to do a couple of weeks, we're going to do biographies. I'm probably going to pick out Aquinas because he's the big nerd, and probably somebody who's not a big nerd. We're going to do a couple of weeks on Christian biography somewhere in the middle here. I don't know where. We'll figure it out as we go. Because you need to know Christian. You need biographies to encourage you. You need to know these guys, these people, these gals. We'll do some biography. We'll do a little bit of kind of the standard, political history, names and dates, and those are the ones you may find boring, but we got to know some of that. We're going to do a little bit, a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks on theological issues. We'll do something on the atonement. We'll get that in a second. And then we'll do maybe a couple of weeks on ordinary life. There's a great book I just got. Came out this last year. I'm going to use it. It's by a guy named Nicholas Orm. He's at Yale. It was published by Yale. Going to Church in Medieval England. I'll read through it so you don't have to. And I'll let you know what fun things they did in church in the Middle Ages. How did church look like? So we'll do a couple of ordinary stuff. And that'll be it. That'll be it. 12 weeks on that. Kind of give you a taste of a lot of different things. Some you may like, some may not. That's how I do things. But let's get on to what makes the ages middle. Why do we call them the Middle Ages? Briefly, a couple of things. Item number 2 on your outline, 2A. The Middle Ages are middle because they wanted to preserve patristics. They wanted to preserve the patristic heritage of the early church. They wanted to preserve ancient church history. They wanted to mediate it to future generations. That's why, by the way, where do you think our copies of Augustine come from? They come from monks who copied them down. Where do our copies of Plato come from? Julius Caesar, monks who copied the Bible, monks who copied it down. That's why I give you a picture here. This is a beautiful 15th century manuscript. The gold doesn't come out in my printer, sorry. But if you look at it in person, it's beautiful. It's called The Dark Hours. It was a prayer, a devotional. It was the Our Daily Bread for one guy in Belgium in the 1450s. So one very rich guy. He had this made. It's one of the beautiful expression of medieval art. Anybody who says the Middle Ages were dark and dull, look at this right here. It's gold and it's beautiful. But the part of their goal was to preserve the early church and pass it on, preserve this Christian heritage. Second thing, one other point on that. We often insult the Middle Ages because we say that's where they get very nerdy, they get very scholastic, they get very academic. But you got to realize, before that, we didn't have a systematic theology. You couldn't go and get a one-volume copy of basic Christian doctrines. There wasn't such a thing. John Damascus in the East, he had one book. Augustine didn't do it. He didn't put together one systematic theology like you have, like Berkhoff or Bavinck or whomever. They did. The Middle Ages did. They put it together. They systematized it. They wrote it all down. They organized it. You may disagree with the order. You may disagree with some things, but they did it a lot. Obviously, Aquinas did it. So they wanted to preserve the early church theology and pass it on. And one of the reasons why we have so much is because they did. They did. Second point. Contrary to what we think, medieval life is not just about the church. Rather, theology impacted all of life. It was the one place in time, really, maybe Puritan New England, I don't know, but I could debate that. It was the one place in time, generally, where theology and society were connected. It was the one place in time where medieval theology was not abstracted from life. That's only the case for some of the weird mystical monks. Most of the monks lived near towns. Most of them interacted with ordinary people. It was only the weird ones who kind of went off on their own. Most people had to be involved with the church. Why? There was no welfare state. There was no welfare state. There was no state-operated charity. The only people doing that were the monasteries, the churches. The only people who were out there caring for those in the margin of society were the churches. That's why the church is also interested in keeping the peace. There were rules for warfare. We make fun of the knights, we make fun of kind of, those guys on the horses, and, they think life's all about charging, and they don't understand that there are rules for warfare. But the church said, look, you cannot fight during harvest season. Now, Jim, you're a farmer. Why do you think the church said you can't fight during harvest season? Yeah. If the farmer dies, who's going to get the crops? You know, if he dies in battle, because the knight, just stabs him and kills him, well, no crops. Yeah. Absolutely. So the church, far from being, bloodthirsty crusaders, we'll have a class on the Crusades, don't worry. But far from being a bloodthirsty crusaders, was invested in keeping the peace. They said you cannot fight from Friday night until Monday morning. You had the weekend off. You had the Sabbath off, right? You had the Lord's Day off, right? You couldn't fight during that. Third, church-state relationship. One of the biggest questions in the Middle Ages is, how did the church and the government go together? Now, there's a very popular view of things that is wrong. A very popular view is what we call a Constantinian view. That's the Eastern Church. We'll get to that. The Eastern Church idea is the Roman idea where the emperor's in charge. The emperor is the Pontifex Maximus, the ruler of the religious system, what we call a one-sword model. That's in the East. That's the Byzantines, because they were Romans. But in the West, you have, and we'll get into some of this, I don't want to belabor the point, but you have what comes to be called a two-sword model. Two-sword model, in essence, is the Pope is in charge of the spiritual things, the emperor is in charge of the temporal things, the earthly things. This is why Harry Truman was a medieval president. Harry Truman, 1947, I think, 46, 48, one of those years. he gets together with his advisors, and he says, look, post-war, we beat the Nazis, now we're up against the commies. Now we're up against the Russians and the Chinese. What do we need to do? We believe in God. We're Judeo-Christians. What we need to do is to get all the religions of the world to fight against the communists. They're atheists. It made sense for him. And so what does he do? He talks to his advisors, he talks to the cabinet. He says, all right, I want you to contact the Pope. You're our ambassador in the Vatican. Call up the Pope and get him over here to D.C. He called up the Southern Baptists. He said, get the head of the Southern, whoever the top Baptist is in America, get him up to D.C. He called up the Methodist, the Episcopalian, Archbishop of Canterbury. He called the Dalai Lama. He calls up, the funniest thing is, he calls up his ambassador to Turkey, and he says, hey, go talk to them and find out who the top Muslim is. Who's the best Muslim? Get him over here to D.C. We're having a meeting. That's a two-swords view. Right? His idea is, these are all the people in charge of the spiritual things. I'm the American president. I'm in charge of earthly things. Get them all over here. Get them all together. And let's fight the commies. Right? Well, that's a medieval view. Harry Truman would have been a great Middle Ages ruler. It's separation of church and state in some ways, right? In some ways. We'll get to all that down the road. So finally, I guess we have a few minutes here. What's the fruit in the Middle Ages? Why should we really study it? What's the fruit? In other words, what are the thoughts that you think that are so basic and ordinary, but actually come from the Middle Ages? What are the thoughts that you have? What are the beliefs that Christians have today in America that would not have happened except for the Middle Ages? Let me give a few things. Before I do, any questions of what I commented? Okay. First, Augustine. The fruit of the Middle Ages is that everybody in the Middle Ages, every Christian in the Middle Ages, and therefore every Christian today talks about grace. Every Christian in the Middle Ages was, to some degree, semi-Augustinian, to put it a different way. There were no Pelagians. There were no full-on, hardcore Pelagians. The worst people in the Middle Ages, in the Catholic Church, were semi-Pelagians. right? And I'll explain those terms down the road, right? But the point is, the Middle Ages were all about St. Augustine. Everybody, you had to believe in Augustine. You had to think about Augustine. You had to think about sin and grace and free will and predestination. You had to think about those things. You could differ on some of you could differ on them. But everybody had to read their theology through St. Augustine. That is, there was no one who could just stand up and say, we are naturally good, we don't need God's grace. Everybody said, you need God's grace. And even today, in the Christian church in America, by and large, even our Arminian brothers, even so many of our friends and brothers and sisters have some idea of God's grace, requiring God's grace. Now, again, I use a lot of terms there. I'll delve into that down the road. But the second major question, I think this really distinguishes the Middle Ages from what gone before. In the early church, you had a lot of questions about Jesus. How can Jesus be God? How can he be man? How can he be both together? How can he be the God-man? The Middle Ages switched the question. They switched the question from how can Jesus be to why was Jesus? Why is Jesus? How can Jesus be God and man together? That's been settled. Everybody came to agreement in the councils, right? And now the question becomes, why did he do it? Why? You see the shift here, right? It's a huge, it's a shift from Jesus out there. Why did he do it? And eventually Luther will say, he did it for me. Eventually you'll get down to Luther and he'll say, he did it for me. And that's when you have the shift of Reformation. Right? But it takes thousands and thousands of years for that question to move from how did Jesus become incarnate to why did he do it? That's why we'll look at Anselm. And that's really the third thing here. It's related. The atonement. Your belief on the atonement, your belief on substitutionary atonement, your belief on the atonement is still, by and large, a medieval belief. Now, many say, well, that's why it's wrong. It should be scrapped. Don't agree. Again, that's a very pejorative view of the Middle Ages. But our belief, basic Christian belief on the atonement, is by and large a medieval belief in its various ways, both Anselm and Abelard, as we'll get into down the road. I've already hit on a little bit the subjective application of the atonement. The great question of the late Middle Ages, the great question of the Reformation, what you call justification or sanctification. How does God's grace work out in my life? You will never understand Luther and Calvin. You will never understand that question unless you get what they were talking about, unless you read 100 years, 200 years before and see how those debates had played out. One last thing, I didn't mention it here, but language. Huge. The Middle Ages was a huge forum, a huge ground for discussions about language. How can we talk about God? How can we speak about God accurately? How can we talk about his ways? How does he communicate with the human race? That's why even to this day, so much of the way we talk about God, the way we interpret the Bible even, is connected to what Aquinas talked about God, how he handled those situations. When you speak about God, what are you talking about? Is there any connection with what these words say right here? And if there is, how can that happen? How do we know we're actually just not making up words and just pretending? The medieval church wanted to answer that question. It's the same reason why they asked, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Because they so desperately wanted to have earth and heaven. They wanted their life and God's life to connect. Desperately they wanted that. So there's a lot we can cover, a lot we can talk about here. The last thing I'll say, one last thing maybe. I'm sorry. I keep finding one last thing. The medieval period was not dark. It was not unhelpful. It was not only concerned with power and money and its stuff. It was a missionary period. The great missionary spread between 400 and 1,000 went as far as the Ural Mountains, farther than Hitler got when he invaded Russia. It went Far north is Iceland and Norway. The spread of the gospel, they were evangelistic, okay? That's the point I'm making. Far more evangelistic than we think about. So again, I'm trying to convince you that this ain't going to be a waste of your time. In fact, it's going to be something that I hope for all of us will help us appreciate who we are as Christians today based upon where we've been before. And if you doubt me, there's a whole thing about Spurgeon on the back. Spurgeon and Roman Catholics who trust in Christ, right? Basically, the importance, even then in the 1800s, of the medieval Roman inheritance in preaching about Christ. So, we have time for one question, comment, or concern. All right. Patrick, yes. Yeah, so that's a great question. By and large, quick answer, obviously generalization, right? You can always find someone who doesn't believe. But by and large, in the ordinary church in England, let's say around 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, because the preaching was primarily a homily that is somebody else's, text they had written and produced, the preaching would have trickled down from the universities, from other pastors, other well-known priests. You'd give their theology, and their theology would be influenced by the churches and universities in Paris and Oxford and Bologna, and so on. Obviously, there's going to be variation, but the success of Augustinian theology by the year 529 in the Synod of Orange in France, right? The success of Augustinian theology meant that the training you received as a priest, the training you received as a bishop at the universities, a full-on Pelagian identity was out of bounds. I mean, if that's kind of what you're hitting at. Yeah. It would depend. I mean, obviously, just like today, it would depend upon the local pastor, local priest. I mean, I couldn't say in every medieval church, obviously. I would say so. I would, let me finish reading the Nicholas Orme book about ordinary life medieval England, going to church, and then I'll get back to you, if that's okay. But. So, yes and no. I mean, I don't want to talk about all this, but if you want to read one book about Middle Ages, there's a book by a French guy written about 20 years ago. It's a classic. It's called Montaillou. It's a French town in southern France, technically Occitan town, and a lot of Cathars there. And so what you actually have on the ground, there's a lot of superstition, there's a lot of folklore, there's a lot of local customs, and there's Christianity mixed in with that. So the real on the ground, just like today. I mean, you and I get our information from Facebook half the time. You and I are influenced by what we saw in the news this week. Our Christianity is as much influenced by some YouTube video we saw as it is by a local pastor, right? Just like maybe, Patrick, our medical thoughts are as influenced by who we know and who we talk to as they are by our local pediatrician, you might say. So in that respect, not terribly different. Yeah, but great question, Patrick. We can talk more later offline. Well, Jim, why don't you close us in prayer, if that's okay? Thank you all for the time.